Well, we are now in the lead up to a federal election, and all eyes are on whether the Labor government of Anthony Albanese will be re-elected for a second term, or will he become the second Prime Minister after James Scullin in almost 100 years to only lead a government for one term. We will find out next month. The state of Victoria, where we are, is shaping up to be a battleground state. For many years, it's been Labor heartland. At the moment, Labor holds 25 of the 39 seats in this state at the federal level. At the state level, Labor has been in government for 75% of the last almost 40 years, since the 1980s. And at the federal level, the two-party preferred vote in Victoria, Labor's won 14 out of the last 16 federal elections. But this wasn't always the case. 70 years ago this month, the Labor Party split over the issue of communism. The result of this Labor Party split was a prolonged period of electoral irrelevance for the party, particularly in Victoria. And while Labor did start to gain ground in states like New South Wales and Queensland, in Victoria it continued to be a political outlier. This was a state where Labor just struggled to secure power and failed to evolve. It wasn't until the early 1970s when a new generation of Labor reformers, the participants, would modernise the party, decentralise its power structures and bring it into alignment with the changing Australian society. Their struggle, participants, and their eventual success laid the groundwork for the party's resurgence. Yet that tension between Labor's traditional working class base and the demands of its emerging progressive middle class supporters would never fully subside. In many ways, the tension between these two groups and their interests continues to define Labor's challenges even today. Well, joining me for our Afternoon Light Live today is Professor of Politics at Monash University, Paul Strangio. Welcome to Afternoon Light. I can't even say it. Afternoon Light Live, Paul.
Hi, Georgina. Pleased to be here.
Yeah, great to have you here, Paul. And to our audience today, welcome. This is a webinar. We can't see you, but you can see us. Please make sure you use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I believe it's on the right-hand side, but if it's on the left, I'm sorry, I got it wrong. There's a Q&A button anyway that you can put your questions into. Paul and I will have a discussion until 3 p.m, so for approximately 30 minutes, and then we'll go to your Q&A. So don't be shy. We love lots of questions, and it'll be a very interesting discussion about this fascinating period in Australian politics and the contemporary consequences of it too. So, Paul, tell me about the Labor Party 70 years ago, so 1955, and I guess 1954 too, because that's also important in this time. What was happening?
Well, if we wind back, Georgina, this time 70 years ago, early April, the party was disintegrating. It was a time when there was a welter of expulsions. And you had two rival executives, the old executive and the new executive, and each of them were casting members out. And that period of savagery peaked on the 7th of April 1955 when the so-called new executive, and it was the executive that had been recognised in March at a special federal conference as the legitimate executive. It was the anti-grouper executive, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. Well, on the 7th of April, having first said to, party members, MPs, you need to pledge loyalty to us, on the 7th of April, it expelled more than 100 members, and that included some 18 state MPs and 6 federal members of the House of Representatives. One, Jack Mullins, had all been expelled. That group, which included figures like Stan Keon, the member for Yarra, they would have become known as the Sacred Seven. They were the 7 that walked out of the federal Labor caucus. There were also 78 branches were declared bogus that month. And it's really interesting that where so many of those branches were declared bogus and there was absolute mayhem was in the inner industrial suburbs of Melbourne.
Which is Labor's heartland.
Labor's heartland.
Yeah.
And the reason was because it was in those suburbs where the Labor Catholic tribalism was strongest. And so you had almost a scorched earth in the inner city. And then the split culminates, if you like, on the 19th and 20th of April in the Legislative Assembly here in Victoria, when Henry Bolte moves a no confidence motion in the Kane senior Labor government. And remember, Labor had waited for more than half a century to form a majority government. It had in 1952 finally, and now this government is torn down when the Barry Coleman group, those aligned to the old executive, they cross the floor and support Bolte's no confidence motion. As they do, one of the loyalists to the Labor Party throws 30 pieces of silver across the floor, shouting to Barry, "There you are, Judas."
Wow.
So, these are very emotional times. And as I said, it's a key moment. This government's destroyed and Labor won't be back in power in Victoria for a generation. And that literally a generation, because the next Labor Premier in 1982 is John Cain Jr.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful piece of symmetry, historical providence when he becomes Premier.
Quite Shakespearean too, I think.
It is. It's spirit. Now, the antecedents, though, what was this all about?
Well, and also, Paul, it wasn't the first time Labor had split, was it?
No.
So, I mean, we talk about the Great Labor Split of 1955, 54, 55, but actually there'd been a couple before this quite early on. I mean, Labor Party's founded in the 1870s. You can correct me if I'm wrong.
1890s.
1890s, thank you. That's why you're the professor of politics and I'm not. And it quickly splits. And then again in...
it splits during World War I over the issue of conscription for overseas service. And, of course, Billy Hughes, who's the Labor Prime Minister at that time, walks out of the Labor caucus with his followers. There's a welter of expulsions at state branch levels. And then, of course, Labor splits again in the early 1930s when James Scullin, who you referred to at the beginning of the podcast, was Prime Minister during the Great Depression. And that split was really about what sort of economic policy positions Labor ought to take in the midst of this economic calamity that was unfolding. So there was an organisational problem in Labor, and that was it was built on the assumption that the external party, the extra-parliamentary party, would control the politicians. And that was combustible. It was always combustible, and particularly when Labor was in power, because inevitably when Labor's in power, it will disappoint, it will disillusion, the extra parliamentary party. And remember, you have an industrial wing at this stage. Now, the interesting point is, though, those two splits, Labor in Victoria largely emerged unscathed because it wasn't in office in World War I, and in the early 30s it was in office but a minority government. And so there wasn't much bloodshed in Victoria, unlike in New South Wales, where those splits were really serious. And an interesting thing is then Victorian Labor's not inoculated. New South Wales Labor is almost, they know what a major split's all about, the reckoning, the damage. Victoria's never had that experience really. and now it gets played out in the mid-1950s over the issues of communism and Catholicism.
And just to pick up on that point about the extra parliamentary party, the organisation controlling the MPs, you see Robert Menzies, of course, exploiting that with the faceless men, and mocking, I think it was Whitlam and Corwell, wasn't it, who was standing outside the executive meeting in the it was at the Kingston Hotel.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, this sort of sense that it's these MPs actually have no power. Caucus doesn't have power. It's the the trade union bosses, the executive of the party, which was exploited by the Menzies government.
That's the theory, that they were controlled, that conference laid down a platform that the politicians were meant to abide by. And of course, it didn't really always work like that in practice. But nonetheless, there was an inherent tension. Now, that tension is now gone from Labor, largely because the power has migrated now to the parliamentary party, particularly the leader of the day. The party's been hollowed out in its terms of grassroots, its extra-parliamentary organisation. So in one way, that great dilemma for Labor has now been solved. But you had three great splits in the Labor Party: World War One, early 30s, mid-1950s, where, as I said, it was combustible.
Yeah. So tell me, what was the situation in the lead up to the split of the 1950s? I mean, we're in the Cold War now. Communism is a massive issue. Labor is led by Doc Evatt, who has his own issues as a leader. And I mean, there's some wonderful quotes by Robert Menzies about how he had to stay he was thinking he might retire, but he had to stay in politics to prevent Doc Evatt ever taking the prime ministership. Such was his I guess, lack of regard for him as a politician.
Which is different to say his regard for Arthur Cole, or his regard for John Curtin, or his regard for Ben Chifley.
That's
very
right.
different.
Yeah.
He thought Evatt was dangerous, mercurial, brilliant man, but unstable, effectively.
And a judgment that was shared by
many, including the Labor Party.
Yeah.
Now, we need to go back, though, a step before that to say, well, you've got this historical alignment between Catholics and Labor.
Yeah, because this is a story of sectarianism.
Yeah, it's a story of sectarianism.
Yeah.
And fundamentally, that alignment, it was socio-economic, because Irish Catholics were, predominantly working class. It was also sectarian based because the non-Labor parties were not welcoming to Catholics. They were Protestant fundamentally. There was a strong element of sectarianism in Australian society, which flowed into the political parties. So you had this powerful alignment. It was reinforced by the split of World War One over the issue of conscription, because again, Irish Catholics tended, because of issues to do with Ireland, tended to be strongly against conscription, sceptical of the British Empire. And so that alignment got reinforced in World War One. And what you get is Catholics storming the ramparts of Labor, and they're in very powerful positions in the party. Now, at the same time, you had a socialist strand in the party, and so there was a tension always there between the radical socialist strand of Labor and the Catholics. But what really, if you like, ignited that tension was when you get into the 1930s, the small but disciplined Communist Party of Australia starts to wield influence within the trade unions of Australia, starts to infiltrate the trade unions. Once you get into the 1940s, and they had reached very significant position of power in some of the most important trade unions. In the 1940s, the state Labor branches set up things known as industrial groups to combat communist trade union influence in the trade unions. At the same time, a fellow named BA Santamaria, a young, brilliant son of Italian migrants who was very close to Archbishop Daniel Mannix. He was a protege of Mannix. Mannix regarded him as the son he never had. And under his guidance, Santamaria, as another, set up the Catholic Social Studies movement, the movement as it's known.
So we've got the groupers and the movement.
The movement, and they work in tandem, fundamentally.
So the groupers are in the unions, and the movement is sort of outside of the Labor Party, but a Labor aligned, Catholic.
And again, it's exploiting that alignment between Catholics and Labor, Catholics and the trade unions. And they're really, their purpose was to stiffen the anti-communist resolve of, trade unionists and members of the Labor Party. Now, the work of the industrial groups in alignment with the movement, and the movement's strongest here in Victoria.
Yeah, and that's where BA Santamaria is.
It's his influence.
And Daniel Mannix, the Archbishop.
That's right. There was a tradition of Catholic lay militancy in Victoria that flowed out of Mannix. Very much Santamaria is an expression of that as well. He's the ideologue of the movement, but his influence isn't so great in New South Wales, for example. So the movement here is much more ideological, much more militant. And by the early 1950s, what occurs is, yes, the communist influence in the trade unions is being wound back. It's being wound back. But as that occurs, Santamaria's ambitions for the movement are inflating. He begins to entertain the idea that the movement can be a Trojan horse policies. He writes a very famous letter to we can transform the Labor Party. Now, this was a very dangerous, hubristic and fantastical notion, really. But it is dangerous, and it's another one of the forces that are at work. It's inviting a backlash. It's inviting a sectarian backlash. Now, there are other ingredients. It's a very complex story. As I said, Labor's in power for the first time with majority government in Victoria under John Cain Sr. The trade union here, Trades Hall, under a guy called Vic Stout, doesn't believe in parliamentarianism. Never really experienced it before, the fruits of political office. It wants to coerce the parliamentarians, and it's quite happy in this crisis of the early to mid-50s to destroy the Cain Labor government. So there's a series of major industrial disputes. So there's different interweaving forces going on, and then you get Doc Evatt. Who loses the 1954 election, was so confident he was going to win, and he comes out of that paranoid. Robert Murray famously describes his mind, his mind seething with conspiracies about him being robbed of office. He's looking for someone to blame. An instability is starting to develop. And in October 1954, he launches an attack, talking about a famous bombshell letter that there's this disloyal element in the Labor Party, particularly in Victoria. Its organ is News Weekly, which was the organ of the movement, and it sets the whole thing in motion, the split.
And so then you get these expulsions and the what did you call them? The Secret Seven?
Yeah, the Sacred Seven.
Sacred Seven. Sorry, I'm getting my inner Blyton book.
And I'll note someone like Stan Keon is a fascinating character, the member for Yarra. People talked about him as a potential Prime Minister. He was a brilliant orator. His problem was, again, he was too militant. And in 55, one of the great election battle the post-split election battles is when Jim Cairns takes him on in Yarra. And it's a fight, tooth and nail fight, and Cairns just wins.
So Evatt releases this statement. It's in October 54, but it takes a while for the consequences to flow through. As you say, it's the 7th of April 1955 is the key date. So why does it take so long for the consequences to?
Well, there's
6
a lot
months?
of, what would you say? I think there's a lot of shock initially. There's decisions to be made about who is the legitimate executive in Victoria. Then there's the decision to have a special federal conference in Hobart in March 1955 to effectively, resolve that. And that's where you get these amazing images of different delegations from Victoria. One gets locked out, the other's admitted. So you get it's a sort of slow-moving car crash for several months. And there's an important question: who could have been the emollient force at that point? And people like Patrick Kennelly, a very important numbers man in Victorian Labor, Arthur Call, the senior Labor member of Parliament at that time. Problem was they'd been burnt by the movement. Things had turned, if you like, so nasty in those last stages. And just for example, they tried to drive Kennelly out of his seat in the Victorian Parliament. They went after Corwell, got him off the Victorian executive and continued to go after him even at a point where he was mourning the death of his son. So there's great personal bitterness. And so no one seems, if you like, capable of standing back while all this is unfolding. I think the other interesting thing is the New South Wales Party, again, largely because the long history of failure of Victorian Labor, was quite happy for Victorian Labor to be a sacrificial lamb.
Right. And you think that's why Doc Evatt, as the leader and from New South Wales, had maybe less concern about the impact of what he was doing to Victorian Labor?
I think there's an element there. It was true that the movement was strongest here. It was most strident here. It was most ideological here. So there was a reason for singling out Victoria in that sense. But there's no doubt there was a sense, whereas in New South Wales they would step back from the brink, and the bishops, they decided we must have a strategy of stay in and fight. We'll continue to battle communist influence, but within the party. Because again, they knew New South Wales Labor had delivered a lot of things to Irish Catholics over the year by being in government. There's a very different mentality in Victoria. Mannix has a different mentality again, militancy. He's not one to soothe things. So very different dynamics. And one of the Labor power brokers in Victoria, Dinny Lovegrove, famously says when things are falling apart, well, he says the New South Wales men, they're willing to fight to the last Victorian. So they're not willing to sacrifice themselves.
Yeah.
They're willing to sacrifice Victoria. So in some ways, I think this story is, because of Labor's long history of failure, it's coming home to roost in the mid-50s.
Yeah, and I guess because of that long history of failure, there probably wasn't that, the sort of moment where level heads prevailed and they thought, well, actually the electoral consequences of this split, and what we end up with is two Labor parties in Victoria, of course, the Labor Party and then the Democratic Labor Party, which is aligned with the anti-communist Catholics. That has really, really serious electoral consequences for Labor, and of course great consequences for Robert Menzies and the Liberal Party.
Yeah.
So tell me about those consequences.
Well, go to 55, the 55 election. Of
Yeah.
course, this occurs after this mayhem in the Labor Party, the fall of the Kane government, the split in the federal caucus. And Menzies, being an astute politician, calls a early federal election for the end of 1955 to exploit Labor's carnage.
Yeah.
Now, remember, Menzies had won the election in 51 narrowly. He squeaked over the line in 1954. But they win handsomely in 55 due to the carnage in Labor, and particularly the carnage in Victorian Labor, where this new emergent force, it was initially called the Anti-Communist Labor Party, demonstrates that it's able to win a vote in the teens.
Yeah.
As it takes that vote from Labor. And what it does, because its rationale is to keep Labor out of office, it will transfer in a watertight way its preferences to the coalition.
So your anti-communist Labor voter is extremely disciplined. They follow the
ticket,
ticket, and put Labor last, or
because
at least below the Liberal Party.
And some people call it a spoiler party, the DLP, what becomes as known. In 1957, it takes that name, the Democratic Labor Party. And fundamentally, that's its function, to keep Labor out of power. And so from 55, and Robert Mann has said that that's when men's ascendancy starts. So it is significantly a function of the Labor split.
And I should note, we have here our latest book, The Menzies Ascendancy, and you've got a chapter in this book about this very topic. And it's that 54 to 61 period when Menzies seems unbeatable.
Yeah, and what's particularly as a result of the split, Labor in Victoria is stuck on a third of the House of Representative seats. It's stuck on 30%.
Yeah.
And, only winning that many seats in Victoria, it cruels Labor's federal chances. And it cruels those chances for 17 years. And it's even worse at the state level, of course, where the effects are even more calamitous. Because the other thing really interesting to note is what happened to Victorian Labor post-split. It turned into an inward-looking, paranoid, sectarian, anti-Catholic party run by a junta, as it was known, industrial left unions who weren't interested in winning political power largely. They believed they would prove their principles by standing firm on certain policies. State aid for non-government schools is one of them. They opposed it. So it's a sort of got a bunker mentality.
Yeah.
And it's totally, if you like, the antithesis of a party that can compromise and win power.
It's amazing to look at the figures. I think it's the 61 election when, as you say, in Victoria, Labor's getting about 30% of the vote. But it's the seats, apologies. But in the other states, it's getting 58.7 in New South Wales, 61.1 in Queensland, 54.6 in South Australia, 60% in Tassie. Doesn't do well in WA, only 33.3. But, but for Victoria and to a lesser extent WA, which wouldn't have had that many seats, Labor's winning.
Yeah, it's indisputable that Arthur Cole would have been Prime Minister in 1961 if not for the split in the Labor Party and its ongoing legacy in Victoria. And as late as 1969, when Gough Whitlam was leader, and again, Victoria's a millstone then, it's very likely Whitlam would have won in 1969 if not for Victoria.
Yeah. Well, look, Paul, we've got to 3:01.
Oh,
So
have
I
we
feel I know
already?
already, and I only asked half my questions, and now I have to
I warned you
cede
about
my had to cede my spot to the audience. So I've got quite a lot of questions coming through here. So look, this is a contemporary question here. Do you see any similarities between today's Labor government and the government in 1955? Or that potentially might mean the Labor Party in 1955. I mean, they're quite different.
They're quite different beasts. If I see a parallel at the moment in what's going on, and I assume we're talking about the Allen State Labor government and its
Oh, that's a fair point. Might be.
its
Yeah.
chronic position at the moment. It more reminds me of what happened to the Kane Junior Labor government by the election, by the end of its period in office. So by the end of the 1980s, early 1990s. Interesting parallel, of course, the 1990 federal election. State Labor here was so on the nose under John Cainby, and there was the financial scandals and there was industrial strife. Some of that actually whipped up bad memories from Cain and what had happened to his father. But leaving that aside, Labor lost at that federal election in 1990 9 seats, and it came within a whisker of Hawke losing office. And Cain went soon after because federal Labor was furious with the Victorian Labor. So I do wonder if we get a similar dynamic with Labor losing a lot of seats at this forthcoming election, whether Allen's grip on power will be broken. And I think it's something worth watching.
Ah, well, that's yeah, definitely one to watch. She certainly hasn't experienced the kind of Teflon-like performance of her predecessor in Daniel Andrews.
No,
So
I think
just,
there's a political science term for what's happened to Jacinda. I have some sympathy for it. It's called the glass cliff. She's inherited a mess. She's inherited a mess.
yeah. Another audience member has asked, are there any parallels between the 55 split and the more recent divisions with Australian political parties? And I guess the question I would add to that is, while the Labor Party hasn't split in 70 years, it's we see the rise of the Greens, who are almost like a sort of left-wing flank of the Labor Party, pursuing a lot of overtly sort of socialist policies, and then their green agenda as well, environmental agenda as well. But I mean, a lot of their mandate is a socialist one. And the Labor Party has really sort of eschewed that to be a party much more of the centre, very much the centre left. Do you see that as a phenomenon that repeats some of the trends from the 50s?
Look, it's very different, but I have for a number of years now called the emergence of the Greens a de facto split in the Labor Party. And I think, even think about the way they hunt after Labor's traditional heartland seats. Now, those seats, of course, have dramatically changed, but nonetheless, the fact that they're going after what was Labor's heartland, I think in some ways Labor's lost. It's lost something from that in the sense that there isn't the same sort of, if you like, what's the right sort of energy that emerges from that dynamic of the tussle between the left and the more mainstream of the party. There was an energy that came out of that. But another way, it makes for Labor a much more manageable party because it no longer has, it effectively doesn't have a left now. And it's over there.
There's some disagreements, I guess, around foreign policy. You see in the lead up to Labor conferences on Palestine, Israel, those sorts of issues. They're pretty well managed, though, I'd say, because the Greens can be, really to the left on those issues. And if you really take that view, then go join the Greens.
And I think also probably has an adverse effect on the Greens too, because then there's nothing to contain them either. When those two flanks used to work together, although there was conflict, the left would provide some energy. It would hold the mainstream Labor Party to account. It would be its conscience to some degree. And at the same time, I think, the mainstream members of the party held the left, exercised some sort of disciplining effect over them and moderated some of their excesses. Both of now sides have lost that. So I think, there's a deleterious effect from that de facto split.
But the advantage for Labor in 2025 versus Labor in 1955 of this split is that the Greens are not there to support Labor's opponents. They'll in the end always support Labor over the coalition. So in actual fact, this is a really convenient split. Yes, you might say it has, I guess, drained a bit of the energy and maybe that sort of constant
tension.
But I mean, maybe it's made Labor more electable because the
yes.
moderate side of Labor is generally going to reflect more Middle Australian views than the left of Labor.
It does, although I think we've had an interesting experience the last 3 years where that moderation, that cautious incrementalism of Anthony Albanese is actually not worked very well with an electorate that is fed up with business as usual. That wants some things to change pretty significantly. And there isn't that energy in Labor. It seems to be. And I'm fascinated by what's occurred with the two major parties. It seems to me now the Liberals the more subversive of the major parties now, whereas Labor has hewed to the centre so much. It's the manager of the status quo almost now. Changing of clothes, I think, is really interesting in 21st century Australian politics and the major parties in that sense.
Yeah, no, that is fascinating. That sense that the two major parties are managerialists rather than ideologically driven.
More ideologically driven than Labor. I think there's no question about that. And again, that's a very significant transformation.
Yeah, and very different from yes, as you say, the Menzies era, where it was about the sort of liberal principles and very sort of ideologically driven in that respect. Another question from our audience about Mannix, Archbishop Bishop Mannix. Did he use the pulpit vigorously to expound his contempt for communism and support for his form of socialism? And I guess this is all from the Catholic encyclicals. And I mean, it's really interesting how involved the Catholic Church is in politics, overtly involved in politics, compared to now it's, church leaders do make political pronouncements, and so much as political issues, but it always seems to be a bit more in the margins than it might have been in Mannix's day.
Yeah, Mannix is fascinating. And even going back to when he first arrived in Victoria, he was willing to push a program, a very sectarian program of advancing Catholics, militant politics, to almost meddle in politics.
And he'd come from Ireland?
Yes. Yeah. And that's all part of it.
Yeah.
There's an energy there. There's if you like, a sense of powerful grievance. And he, even over issues, for example, again, of support for Catholic schools in the early 20th century, he pushes things to almost a sectarian breaking point. So he's consistent with that.
So you think he really promoted sectarianism?
Well, he promoted he promoted the advance, of Catholics and Catholicism in a very militant, aggressive way. And he believed, again, and he supported lay militancy. He supported Santamaria. What occurs after the split is, of course, the Vatican intervenes in 1957 and says the movement must be wound up. We'll no longer have this meddling in politics and this meddling in the trade unions. And this is a savage blow for Monash. It's a savage blow for Santamaria. Santamaria then immediately sets up the National Civic Council to sort of work in tandem with the DLP. But nonetheless, Santamaria's dream had really been about working in the Labor Party because of that alignment with Catholics. And that dream's destroyed. So the split doesn't work for him either, in the sense that that was to be his vehicle for transforming Australian society. It was Labor he'd pinned his hopes on. And now, there's this carnage and Catholics are being driven out of the party. So this is not a success for him either in any extent.
Did Santamaria and Mannix, though, moderate their activities once the church, the Catholic Church, the Vatican had said they needed to, or did they just shrug their shoulders and say, well, we take a different view?
Santamaria continued to work through the National Civic Council. His focus tended to shift after the 50s. The domestic sphere had become less amenable to him, so he's focused on the threat of communism internationally. He famously does his TV program. I think you're too young for it.
I'm a bit too young, but I've heard of it.
But point of view from the early, from I think about 1963 to almost 3 decades. And it's a sort of an apocalyptic program where he's warning against the threat of communism. And he's also railing against modernism in the Catholic Church. He's an opponent of Vatican II and the reforms. He sees that as the breaking of traditionalism. He's fundamentally an anti-modernist, Santamaria.
Yes.
But he's an influential figure. For someone who was never a member of a political party, and he famously said, I could never see myself joining a political party because I couldn't accept the compromises that go with it, which tells you a lot about him.
Yeah.
But he wields an enormous influence, and including in the Liberal Party.
Yeah, well,
I
and
think
of course,
that's a fascinating story to this.
Has a very close relationship with Robert Menzies in his retirement.
He does, and of course he has, it's Howard who visits him on his deathbed in 1998. And of course, his protege is no other than Tony Abbott.
Yeah.
And Tony Abbott, to some people believe, Tony Abbott's our DLP Prime Minister.
I have heard that before.
Yeah.
Now, I'm greedily taking up your time when we've got audience members asking lots of questions, Paul. Might the Catholic vote have moved away from Labor even without the split due to their social mobility, with formerly working class Catholics moving up into the middle class during the 50s and 60s? It's an interesting point. And of course, Menzies' adoption of state aid for non-government schools, Catholic schools, really encourages the move of the Catholic vote to the Liberal Party, doesn't it?
No, that's a very good point. The Liberals often hoped, and this was written about a lot, that the DLP would act as a bridge for shifting the Catholic vote from Labor to the DLP, then to the Liberals. And to some degree that occurs, but socio-economic change is driving that.
Yeah.
And the other factor, it's as Catholics are enjoying greater mobility, but also the non-Labor sectarianism is washing out of Australian society by the 60s, and gradually the Liberal Party is becoming, it's not an anti-Catholic party as it once were. It effectively had put up the shutters to Catholics. That changes. It's beginning to change by the 70s, but still, if you look at Fraser's ministry, there's very few Catholics. It's when Howard gets into office, you suddenly look around, there's all these Catholics.
That's true, yeah.
There's Abbott, there's Tim Fisher, there's Pine, there's Brendan Nelson. So I think by the early 2000s, 14 members of Howard's front bench were Catholics. Now, that is such a dramatic transformation.
Yeah. Thinking about the, I guess, post-Cornwall period, of course, Gough Whitlam takes over the leadership. And I mean, he really is the moderniser of the Labor Party and really sees that in order to win government, you're going to have to win over the middle class, as Robert Menzies had identified with his forgotten people. One of our audience members has asked, what was Whitlam's attitude to the split? Did he learn any lessons from it before coming into office and while in office?
Well, it's interesting because there's some footsies in the 60s between trying to heal the split at different times, and different figures are involved. Call at one point, Whitlam at one point. So there are some attempts to mend the split. But I think Whitlam is of a very different tradition in the Labor Party. Of course, he's not. He's not Catholic. He comes from an upper middle.
Comes from Kooyong.
He comes from an
Grew up
upper
in
middle
Cute.
class family.
Born in Cute.
He's culturally very different. He doesn't have that tribalism about him. So I think he's of a total different tradition. And as you said, he's the great remaker of the party. What he does understand, though, is unless you do something about Victoria, we're never going to get anywhere. And it's Whitlam in tandem, and you mentioned the participants, the reformers in Victoria, but it's Whitlam externally who drives intervention in the Victorian Labor Party in 1970-71, where the party is remade. And it's the platform, that remaking, to Whitlam getting elected in 72, and then 10 years on, Kane getting elected to 1982. So he was about, if you like, breaking that dysfunctional post-split Labor Party.
Yeah, but it's a lesson, I guess, for the Liberals, the federal Liberals now. You know, unless you can do something about Victoria. I mean, I said in my introduction, 25 of 39 seats are Labor here.
The Liberal Party currently has 2 metropolitan Melbourne seats. That's all.
Yeah.
That's all. Menzies and on both sides.
Oh, sorry, seats. Deakin.
Deakin. Yeah. That's the only 2 metropolitan Melbourne seats. And there's 2 on the fringes of Melbourne, but without winning more seats in Melbourne, the second most populous city in Australia, there is no road to government for the coalition.
Yeah. Another question is, that's an interesting one. How did the media report on the split? Were different newspapers taking different views, or was it all around condemnation?
Yeah, there was, one thing is about it. Of course, at 2 levels. I think Evatt was depicted as a wrecker, fed into a narrative now of a man who was unstable, who was unelectable, was, if you like, dangerous, reckless. But it also fed into, if you look at the cartoons of the time, suddenly Santamaria emerges. He'd been a shadowy figure. And it fed into a sort of an ethno-sectarian prejudice, the notion of the stilettos and, this shadowy Italian figure that's trying to run, the Labor Party and has now been exposed. So at a whole levels, I think it's very destructive. It's a very destructive force in our political culture.
It is extraordinary that Labor sticks with Evatt for 9 years. I mean,
extraordinary.
He's sort of coming undone. Obviously, I
he's
understand
unwell.
this split, and yet they still stick with him. I think he loses 3 elections in a row, doesn't he, to Menzies?
Well, it was a different era. It was a different era, and Call, of course, would then lose consecutive elections as well. And one of the things we thought about, well, what happens if Call had won in 61, for example? But I was old age. He was 65 by that point. The best was, he was past his best. The society was changing him around him. He was struggling with the changes in the Labor Party. Of course, he held on grimly to the White Australia policy. New modernists in the Labor Party ranks were turning against that policy. So he waited all his career. He waited for a seat for so long, and he finally got there. And then he waited and waited to become leader, and he waited and waited and never became prime minister. You know, it's almost, there's quite a tragic arc to Call's career.
Yeah, yeah. Well, indeed, and to Everett's career
Yes.
too. I
Oh,
mean,
yes.
he's
Because
obviously had
We should never forget, he was a brilliant man, and mercurial and all those sorts of things, but he didn't have the temperament. He did not have the temperament to be a leader of a major political party.
as Menzies had identified.
Yes,
Yeah,
and Menzies
very early
would
on.
have understood that.
Yeah.
This was a time where, again, they saw each other intimately in that federal parliament.
Yes.
And he would have known, he would have been known from Labor members as well, the problems with Evatt.
Yeah. Another question from our audience today, Paul. Are there parallels to the rise of the Muslim vote in this election, with Jason Clare and Tony Burke's seats under attack from that political? Are we calling it a party, or is it a movement? Is it
Hard
is it? I mean, it's a
It's a
religious
loose coalition of
coalition,
movement,
yeah,
if
but
you
it's
like.
around people who share a religious belief, as the DLP had been as well. So there are some parallels, but we're not used to religion in politics these days. Since the 50s, it sort of seems a bit out of kilter with Australia's secular society, doesn't
Yeah,
it?
and my sense is it will remain marginal. I I think, like a lot of people, I'm disquieted by the idea of, a Muslim party or whatever. It does, as much as anything else, because I think these things invite backlashes. They lead to polarisation. They erode, and I think Anthony Albanese said this a number of times. They erode cohesiveness. So, yeah, it leads me to the apprehension. What there isn't, though, there isn't the long historical alignment there. So these inchoate forces, which may build, but I do think to think of Muslims as monolithic politically is just not accurate.
Yeah.
So I don't think we can draw that sort of parallel to the Catholic vote as it once was in Australia, for example.
Yeah, but it's an interesting point. I mean, this is taking identity politics to sort of the nth degree, that, just because you are a Muslim, you will, we're calling on you to vote for a Muslim vote party, irrespective of your views on the economy, on defence, on health, education, infrastructure. I mean, all these are issues that might not necessarily have a Islamic, I guess, answer to them, and yet this sort of appeal, the Muslim vote appeal, is just around your sort of religious affiliation, which challenges a lot of, I think, our understandings of Australian democracy, and how we built a successful democracy, that we we actually test issues, blind loyalty to, a big boss like you get in some countries, where, you follow a tribal leader or a big political figure. You're actually scrutinising the policies, the principles, and the ambition of a political party, and sometimes you might not agree with it. Sometimes you do.
Well, it will be very interesting to see how salient this appeal is. And look, we are in a particular moment, the Gaza war. It's obviously inflamed these feelings. And so we're at a stress test point. But my hunch is that the idea of a Muslim vote, it won't manifest powerfully. Now, I might be wrong about that, but I think Muslim people are motivated by lots of different things rather than just there when they go to the ballot box. That's my sense.
It's interesting, though, the targeting of particular votes. So we've seen with the rise of the tier, of course, in the last election, that the targeting of Liberal-held seats by that political movement. I guess it's not quite a party. It's not quite a set of independents. There's some level of coordination there. With the targeting of Labor members this time, you have the seat of Wills, a traditional Labor heartland seat, actually held by a Muslim Labor MP, but he has, I guess, made clear his views that are not overtly pro-Palestinian and probably seen as a bit more sympathetic to the Israeli cause. And so he's getting a lot of focus from the Greens and left-leaning groups in that electorate. So that sort of appeal to, if you're a Muslim in that electorate, vote against this Labor MP. Is that sort of continuing the teal phenomenon we saw last time?
What's continuing, of course, is the fragmentation of the electorate.
Yeah.
We're fragmenting. There's no doubt about it. This has been going on now for some decades, obviously. What we know is the major parties were very good at accommodating diversity in the electorate. I think that my own sense is their capacity to shapeshift, to cater to that diversity, has reached a sort of breaking point. And what we're now getting is, on all levels, we're getting these sort of breakouts, these insurgencies. And I think that's the shape of politics as we go forward, for good or worse.
I mean, we've taken the two-party system for granted. You participated in a dialogue we had last year on this very issue, and we're about to release our paper on that, actually. We could just have a multi-party system. There are lots of democracies that are successfully run countries that do have multi-party systems. But do you think Australia's democracy is served well by the, I guess, horse trading that you would inevitably get from a multi-party government?
Well,
and we may very well be faced with a multi-party government.
One of the fundamentals of, our Westminster system was the idea you have a strong government, strong opposition. Deakin famously said we can't have 311s in the field. The system works better where you've got two teams.
Yeah.
One governs, the other holds them to account. But a fundamental thing that's occurring here is that the Australian people, there's a quiet revolution going on. And it's their voting behaviour is changing. And I think we have to adapt to that. We can't wring our hands and wistfully want the return of the era where the two major parties dominated, 80, 90% of the primary vote. Those days have gone, and we need to adapt. And I'm one of those who actually thinks that a multi-party system, power sharing, can be dynamic, can enliven things. It's an optimistic view, but anyway, I think we have to make the most of it. And we need to continue to innovate with our parliamentary democratic system. I think one of the things I always know about Australia, we're great innovators. We were great innovators. I think the system has got stale in recent decades, and we've got to think about ways to enliven it. And maybe the Australian people are doing that for us by the way they're voting.
Maybe. Well, we'll find out in 31 days, I think it was. I got a message today. Paul, we're at 3:30. We better close now. Thank you so much for joining me on Afternoon Light. Been a fantastic discussion, as I knew it would be. A quick shout out to our audience about our upcoming events next week. On the 9th of April, we have the launch of The Menzies Ascendancy, this lovely book. And the Lord Mayor of Melbourne, Nicholas Rees, will be doing the honours there. So he'll be absolutely fascinating with his views on Menzies, I'm sure. And then at the end of this month, on the 29th of April, former Governor-General's Peter Cosgrove will be delivering our Anzac oration here in Melbourne. Thanks so much for joining us, and hope to see you next time.